Well, I was at St. Vladimir Seminary. I had converted to Orthodox Church at Wheaton College and then went to the seminary afterwards. When I finished the seminary, I was invited to go and teach when I finished St. Vladimir's, I was invited to go to teach in St. Herman Seminary because they needed an Old Testament professor. Um, while I was there, I was also at first teaching patristics and later church history. So this in 1982 and was there until 1996 with a short break in the middle. But the school had been founded in 1973 because the state of Alaska, after the Russian Revolution, they had very few priests. They didn't have a school. They had some education for priests, but a very small number. So after the canonization of St. Herman, this kind of called attention to Alaska, and so the Father Joseph Krita and Archbishop Gregory founded the seminary in Kodiak. And so it had been running for more than 10 years when I came. But our students were mostly Alaskan natives, and the idea was to train them, many of them to serve as readers in the villages, because there were a very small number of priests relative to, I think, about 86 parishes in the villages of Alaska. So most of the villages had services without priests, the reader services, and our students were being trained to help conduct those services, but also with the idea of preparing for deacons and priests. So we had a 4-year undergraduate program at that point. We had a bachelor's granted by the state of Alaska. It was different, of course, because the people were, we had mostly Yupik Eskimos, but we also had Aleuts and Indian and Kodiak Aleuts students. They all had different languages, but let's say, standard language, official language in Alaska is English, so we were able to teach in English. And because each group had their own language, that's how the normal intercommunication was with English. So that was not so much of a difficulty for me. But adjusting to the students, different culture was a little bit of a challenge, but once you get used to it, you can adapt your teaching to the students and how their level and how they're learning. So they were because the positions mostly, where they were working for didn't have salaries, and they were very low salaries. They mostly came out of interest that they wanted to be part of the church life. So, and in the Alaskan village, the church, in a way, is the center of village life. So that made for a very pleasant environment, that the students were sort of had genuine interest and desire to serve the church. So we didn't really have the problem of students that were there but didn't have interest in the program in this way. But they were there because of the program. So they were there for for religious reasons, some more. So this, so the part of the interest of being there was getting to know something about the history of the church there, the missionaries. We had St. Herman of Alaska had lived in a small island right near the seminary. His relics were in the main church in the town. So we had services, Kathis, every week to St. Herman, and could venerate his relics. There was other saints that were part of the mission, but then we also, from the students, learned about the important people in their villages and things that had happened there. So that was very interesting. And then also getting to visit the students sometimes in their villages. And I guess traveling around. It's a beautiful state. And but I guess the way of life was based on hunting and fishing mostly. They don't have very much agriculture there. And so it was when you went to the village, you were kind of living in a different world, a kind of not so connected to our modern society, but also a world in which the church was a central role. So these were communities, although in many ways they were convert communities. They had, of course, St. Herman came more than 200 years ago, but up in the eBOOK area, some of the villages had converted in late of the 1930s. So these were, let's say, rather places that culturally were rather recent as being Orthodox cultures, but they were very zealous, and it was nice to live in an Orthodox society. Even though it was not like a country like Greece or Russia, but it was a society within the tundra area, and you had more, let's say, area full of villages where the Orthodox Church, an Orthodox calendar and life was kind of the central and kind of the way of life. So that was a really nice experience.
Can you speak more specifically to the question of how Orthodoxy was lived by the locals and things that you maybe learned from them about the faith?
Yeah. Well, one thing that struck me is that they had a very strong sense of hospitality. So there was, and that their life was, let's say, relatively undistracted. So they were not caught up in, they went hunting and fishing, and they, many of them like to do other things, to watch movies and stuff like that. But there wasn't a lot of, let's say, other agendas other than just living and the life in the church for our students. So that was something, I guess, that was very nice about them. And then that they also were very, let's say, community-oriented in the sense of working together and, in a kind of cooperative way, sharing kind of life. Was not so individualistic, perhaps, as we are, but I guess the centrality of the church life, the services, the preparing for singing, the interest in singing. I remember we were traveling down a river for some family thing. They had to move from one village, maybe the winter village, to the summer location, and just having the young people singing an akathist along the way as just a normal part of the boat trip. I thought that was very nice. It wasn't something that was organized by a priest or a church. It was just something that they decided to do themselves. They had an interest in the saints and the Christian faith sort of on their own, I guess, because the services, they had them in their own languages, originally the native languages, but then now also with English. Some places had some Slavonic still, but it made it all accessible to them. They had that for most of the time that they've been Christian. So there wasn't a disconnect, especially in the village where even the priest may only come occasionally. The life, church life, really centered on the people themselves. They had to make the services happen, and so it was more organic and not just something passive where some specialist would be there and you come and just attend. But that was yeah. So it was very nice being there. I don't know. Okay, well, the church in Albania goes back to the apostolic period. In Durrës, we had the tradition of the visit of St. Paul, and that the apostle Caesarius was the first bishop of the city, and St. Asti, the martyr, after him. So there's a long history of the Orthodox Church in Albania. However, this history was to some extent interrupted by the Turkish conquest of the Balkans. So around 1500, the Turks took over. A lot of churches, monasteries, schools were destroyed in the initial 100 years or more of the conquest. So there was a break. The church then did continue. So in the 1600s and 1700s, churches were, in 1800s, churches were being built under the Turkish Ottoman government, and things were somewhat stable, but the number of Orthodox was declining as people were converting to avoid persecution. Then, so by World War I, only about 20% of the population was Orthodox. The majority were Muslim, and then we also had a Catholic minority due to the Fourth Crusade and the Venetian occupation of the coastal cities, including Durrës, where we live. Now, during the World War II, as the Germans were defeated and the Italians were defeated, Russia moved into Eastern Europe, and this included Albania. So the communists took over the government there. And there was some persecution of the church, but not a total persecution. But when the Russians wanted to replace the dictator of Albania, the Albanian dictator chose to go under the protection of the Chinese government, Mao Zedong, and Albania became more isolated. But then in 1967, when the Cultural Revolution occurred in China, the Albanian government decided to implement this by eliminating all religion from Albania, which was included not just the Orthodox, but the Roman Catholic and the Islamic religions. So during that time, a lot of Orthodox churches were destroyed, including the monastery of St. Vlach, where the seminary where we live was where that was located, was destroyed. Many of the other buildings were taken over for other uses, in which case they partially survived. Sometimes they were just badly damaged, and the people were forbidden to go to those places, sort of the rural areas mostly. So not only were services forbidden, but the private practice of religion in the home was also forbidden. So outwardly, it appeared that Orthodoxy and religion in general had been eliminated from Albanian life. But in 1991, when communism fell in Eastern Europe in general, and also in Albania, Archbishop Anastasios, who had been a bishop in East Africa, was sent to kind of visit Albania to see if there was anything left from which a church could be rebuilt. And it turned out that many of the people were still believers, but secretly up to this point, and were now anxious to have the church restored. So Archbishop Anastasios at that time was made archbishop and began the work of trying to reconstruct the church. So partly this was, finding the believers, and there were few elderly clergy left to try to begin having services again. And then the other part was trying to get buildings back. So if there were buildings that had been put to other uses, to buy those back from the government, to repair damage to buildings so that they could be used, or in many cases where in buildings in rural areas, the damage, especially to the roofs, would lead to ultimately to the destruction of all of the artwork inside. So that that was kind of important from time-wise, because if rain gets into the inside of a church, the frescoes are damaged, and so he wanted to get roofs on those to preserve what there was of the buildings. But in Tirana, the original cathedral was destroyed, and I guess the bank was built on top of it, but there was one church that would convert it into a gymnasium, so he was able to repurchase that, and that became the new cathedral. There was another church in Tirana that was made into a restaurant, and after some years, they were able to have that, be able to purchase that back to be able to make a church there as well. But in Durrës, where we live, the cathedral was destroyed, and the police headquarters was put on top of it, but some land was reclaimed from a marshy area of the bay, and that was given or sold to the church to be allowed for the use of building a new cathedral, which is there. So the cathedral in Durrës is on reclaimed land. There's also a church there that also had been turned into a restaurant, St. George's up on the hill, and that was restored to the church also. But so around the country, the Archbishop had a lot of work to do. I mean, so actually a huge project in trying to restore church buildings and preserve what was left of the architectural but cultural inheritance of the church in Albania. But then the other thing was to try to provide clergy that would be able to allow church communities to be reestablished. So this he did by founding a seminary. Initially it met in Durrës, but then later it moved to the monastery of Saint Blas, or Saint Blaise, which is on a hill just behind Durrës, coming from the coast. And that's where the seminary is today. So there was emphasis first on training priests so that there could be liturgies again in the different villages and cities around the country. But then after a while, the emphasis, let's say, shifted more to training people for working with children, and teaching children about the faith, and also working with young people, university-age students. This is now, so as the age of the students coming in became younger, that became more the focus, because like the current students tend to be college-age students, and they're too young to be ordained. So they work in the church for a while, and then after some time they're able to be ordained later. But this gives them a chance to be working for the church for some years before they would be considered for ordination. The Archbishop also wanted to provide institutions that would help the church. Well, part of this was an episcopate, so as people converted, there were some bishops who were brought from Greece. So two of our older bishops in the south part of Albania are from that category. And then the other thing was to train new people. So among people who were converting in the 90s, some of them were sent on after seminary to Greece to study, and some of these became bishops. So we have now a number of young Albanian bishops of different backgrounds. Some of these are because although the Orthodox community, which was 20% of the country, that was suppressed, and the Archbishop was trying to bring that back, to bring church life back to them. His vision wasn't just to restore, let's say, a kind of ethnic church, but he had the idea of making the gospel available to everyone who would want it. So that included everybody in Albania, not just people of historic Orthodox background. So some of our bishops are also from Muslim backgrounds as well. But the other thing was to establish schools. So there are church preschools, elementary schools, and high schools that are in traditionally Orthodox areas around the country, as well as we have a high school we had a church high school up near Doris, but that's actually closed now. And then there's a sort of kindergarten to 12th grade school in Tirana as well, which is very large, private school that's run by the church. But there are, I think, about over 30 schools that the Archbishop has founded. And other institutions, was say social ministries, the educational ministries for children, youth ministries, things that would introduce people to the church, but also economically to help people in Albania. So sometimes roads and water systems, things that, because the difficulty there was that some of the villages were very remote, so people there felt that it was difficult to sell things from there, and there was the temptation for young people to leave the villages, which has happened. But by improving life in the villages, he hoped to kind of make it possible for these villages to survive and, in a way, maintain an Orthodox population and culture in the country. Also he founded the university, Logos University, which was really a professional training school in Tirana. It had faculty of business and faculty of medicine, informatics. So that school now is what the seminary, in its sort of wanting to be accredited, the government allowed accreditation this year, but not as an independent school, but as a department of the university. So the university was created with the idea of providing opportunities for people in Albania to have better jobs and better life, but it's also now giving, let's say, a foundation in which the church's theological school could be recognized by the government, and we could be able to hopefully have a master's program as well. Where the seminary is located on the grounds of the monastery of St. Blaise, or Shenblash. So this saint was martyred. There was at this location because there was a stone there from his martyrdom. There's some confusion and questions about who he was, because there's a St. Blaise of Sebast normally associated with Eastern Turkey. There's a question about how that person is, what the connection is, if there's a connection between him and the saint who was martyred in Albania. But this saint was apparently a bishop of a city. Actually, there's a small city of Sebast in Albania, and then up above that city was a cave where he lived as a monk, and then he was brought to Doris, because that was the capital in Roman times, so in the 4th century, and martyred apparently at our location on the hill behind Doris. But his relics were then buried nearby, and then kept at a monastery, which later was taken over by the Roman Catholics, and then brought to Dubrovnik in Croatia. Another famous saint in Albania is St. John Vladimir, who was a Serbian prince or ruler within the Western Bulgarian Empire of, let's see, what's his name? I'll think of it, but he was based in Ohrid, Samuel, of Tsar Samuel of Ohrid. So he was son-in-law to Tsar Samuel, and he ruled over northern Albania and southern Montenegro. But when Tsar Samuel died, there was his son was killed by a usurper, a relative, and in order to prevent a civil war, St. John Vladimir agreed to a peace conference in Ohrid, which he went to, but then when he was killed there by the usurper. He went into the church by the gate of Ohrid, and then when he came out, he was executed by the usurper's troops. So he's probably kind of in the category of these martyrs of non-resistance to evil, sort of like King Wenceslas in Bohemia and Boris and Gleb in Russia. And this was about the same time. Well, in John Vladimir's case, it would have been 11th century when he was martyred. There's also a famous saint for not just for Albania, but for in the Greek world, Saint Cosmas of Aetolis, who was a monk in Mount Athos, but then asked a blessing to be able to go out and to preach, because one of the problems were that because there was such a shortage of clergy and of education, people were Christians living under the Turks were often forgetting the Christian faith and becoming kind of blending into the Muslim population. Many of them are becoming Muslim, which is why the percentage of Christians dwindled so much over the centuries. So St. Cosmas traveled around preaching in the different villages and encouraging them to found schools to be able to study and maintain the ability to read the Greek language. And this helped preserve Orthodox Christianity in the Balkans. So one of the areas that he worked was in the coastal part of Albania. But eventually he was executed by the Turkish authorities, and his body was thrown into the river, and where it floated down the river and kind of landed on the side of the river. In that spot, a monastery was built, and his grave was there. So that's near the modern city of Fir, which is ancient Apollonia. Okay. So that monastery during communist times was flooded from the river and filled with mud. But after communist times, the Archbishop, this was dug out, and so a large part of that church actually is preserved, and some of the frescoes are preserved, and the monastery partly has been rebuilt, and so this is now a place of pilgrimage for the feast of St. Cosmas. His relics were recovered, and by his grave there's a fresco of St. Cosmas over the grave, and so the relics are kept actually in Tirana now, but then brought back to the monastery for his feast, and so people come from all around to go there. In the case actually of John Vladimir that I mentioned, there's his relics also are brought to them because he had founded a monastery near Elbasan, and his relics had been kept there. His body was brought there after he was killed, and so there's a annual pilgrimage to that monastery as well to venerate his relics. And actually, the relics of John Vladimir are packed in cotton, and that cotton is taken out and distributed, and new cotton is put in every year along with the bones. I think. Okay, there's a later saint, Saint Nicodemus of Berat, who was originally from Vithkuch in the south, but he had moved to Berat. So I think in the 1700s is when he lived. He was someone who, I guess, wanted to marry a Muslim woman or something, that he to be converted to Islam to be able to do what he wanted, but then later he repented and went to Mount Athos and became a monk there. And then after a while he decided that he needed to go back to Berat and to sort of renounce his conversion to Islam, and which publicly. So of course, in going to Mount Athos to be a monk, he had returned to his Christian faith, but he wanted to do that publicly since he felt that he had maybe led people into temptation by doing that. So when he came back, he publicly announced his returning to the Christian faith, and then he was executed by the Turks and was thrown off of the cliff, because the city of Berat has a hill which is like an acropolis with a fortress on top, which was the center of the city during the medieval times. So his body was thrown down, and then it was preserved in a church for a while until World War II. During World War II, I think because the Italians destroyed the church in order to widen the road, but some family preserved his relics, especially, well, I guess his head, which was like in a separate reliquary. They actually kept that secret all during the communist period, and then just a few years ago they returned this to the church, and so now after many years the head of Saint Nicodemus Berat is again able to be venerated. So that was kind of very wonderful to be able to visit Berat, and the metropolitan there, Metropolitan Ignati, showed us and allowed us, the students, to venerate his relics. There were other saints. So the Apostle Caesarius, first bishop of Durrës. The second bishop Asti was martyred around the same time as Saint Ignatius of Antioch during the reign of Trajan, and he was crucified in the Forum, probably very close to the area where the amphitheater was built by Trajan also. And so the church, the cathedral in Durrës, is named the Cathedral of St. Paul and St. Asti, after St. Paul the Apostle and St. Asti the Martyr. There was in Durrës also a very famous person from for Byzantine music, John Kukazelis, who helped to, let's say, systematize Byzantine music during the late Middle Ages. And also there are other saints connected with Albania, but of whom I know less about them. But veneration for saints, there's churches, of course. What are the popular Orthodox saints, like Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Nicholas, the Bishop of Myre, Saint Spiridon. These are, Saint Spiridon's relics were brought after the fall of Constantinople, were brought to Corfu, which is right off the south coast of Albania. So there, and actually I think they stopped in Durrës on the way at that point. So there's a lot of veneration to Saint Spiridon. But yeah. There's of monasteries. There's the monastery of Saint Vlach is not really functioning as a monastery. It's now where the seminary and an orphanage are located. But we do have a women's monastery outside of the old monastery grounds. There's a monastery at Ardenica, which was is also near Fear. That's a monastery up on a tall hill, and that's actually used as a monastery by the church today. So that actually was, there was an attempt to destroy it during the communist times, but a bishop who was being held prisoner there, he discouraged the group that came to destroy it, and as a result, the place was preserved as a cultural monument. So fortunately, preserving one of the most beautiful Orthodox places in the country from destruction. So this now is a functioning monastery for the church. And it's not very far from the monastery of St. Cosmas, but it's up on this tall hill that overlooks the flat farming land around Fear, whereas the monastery of St. Cosmas is down by the side of the river, down below the hill. There's also a monastery of the Life-Giving Font, which is being used now down in southern Albania near Durmi, and an old monastery of St. Theodore, the two St. Theodores, that had been turned into a Soviet naval base during the Cold War period. But now, just recently, after a long period of waiting, was restored to the church, and so the church has made some repairs to it, and made it into a place that's able to be used for a boys' camp. So actually, the monastery of St. John Vladimir near Elbasan, that's being used as a women's camp, a girls' summer camp. And St. Theodore, monastery of St. Theodore is a boys' summer camp area. There's also a famous monastery of St. Marina in the eastern part of Albania, up in the mountains. It's very remote, but there's a pilgrimage to that monastery as well. And I think there the monastery buildings are also old buildings that are preserved. OCMC, or the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, was originally established as part of the Greek Archdiocese Mission Center that became endorsed by all of the bishops of the North America that were part of SCOBA around 1985. They've been sending missionaries to help out in different parts of the world, initially focusing mostly on countries that were not primarily Christian, but now also including some places that have Christian presence, but not necessarily a large Orthodox presence, usually not. So we are working with them in Albania. So they've been Americans working as part of the mission center there since the fall of communism. So people who were there with Archbishop Anastasius pretty much from the beginning of the church, helping out with getting the church reestablished, also helping by teaching at the seminary. So there have been actually quite a few OCMC missionaries over the years that have helped at the seminary, and we came in the same way. Just that the school needed people with certain preparations, so they invited us to also go and help. We have people there now who are working at the seminary, teaching, also with working with the youth work, working with let's say student ministries, and then the children's catechism. So they're involved in a large part of the church's work, and often have been helping to lead some of those ministries, as well as also the Protagonist School in Tirana. The director there is from OCMC. They've had directors from OCMC over the years, and still do. So, what people are doing is because in America we have people who are trained with seminary educations or other educations that would be helpful for getting the ministry started in Albania, and so in a way we've kind of provided people who, as let's say specialists, are able to assist the Albanians to have these institutions and ministries operating. It's somewhat different than other missionary efforts by other groups, in that the great majority of people doing the ministries of the church are Albanian. So the clergy are primarily, almost entirely Albanian. The people working in the different ministries, teaching at the seminary, largely are almost all Albanians. So although we've had people there, really we've seen our role as facilitating the Albanian church to develop its work, rather than that we have a large number of Americans going to do the work so the church in Albania would be kind of a passive recipient. Really, our goal is to create organizations and prepare people with the skills to do the church's work themselves, because we see the Albanians as themselves the ones who are going to be the most able to develop church life in their country, and the ones who are going to be able to act as to evangelize the people around them. The people are primarily there, let's say, secular, because they lived through communism. They were educated at communist schools. The media originally was controlled by the government, but it's still largely comes from a secular point of view. And of course, the country is a majority Muslim country. So, so there's a lot of work to do to make to kind of create a healthy church in Albania, but also to present the Orthodox faith to people that are not religious people, whether or not religious Orthodox Christians. So, and it's really what we want is for the Albanian church itself to have the people trained and the abilities to do this. So we're there, OCMC is there to kind of help to get the church off on its feet, because during the communist period everything was really destroyed. So we had believers existing secretly. We had even some priests who continued to do services secretly, others, sometimes lay people baptizing people secretly, but by and large there were very, very few people who knew about the Orthodox faith or were trained to be able to do the services or to be able to teach people about the Orthodox faith. So that's what the last 30 years have been about, is trying to provide this education and, let's say, the leadership to establish the ministries and to train people in the ministries so that they can continue in the future. Well, when having any theological, or let's say any kind of educational program, we tend to think of it in terms of courses and requirements and tests to master a certain body of knowledge. But actually, the Orthodox Church's kind of understanding of theological education is quite different than that of, let's say, the rest of the world. Let's say not just the secular world, but maybe even other religious traditions. Part of this goes back to the 4th century, where there was the controversy with the Arians, particularly the Neo-Arians, who were denying the divinity of Christ and arguing from philosophical logic that Christ could not be divine because he didn't fit the definition of divinity within the philosophical tradition. the fathers of the church, such as Saint Basil, Saint Gregory the Theologian, and Gregory Nyssa, their response was that the knowledge of God is above human reason, so therefore we can't make human reason to be an authority in the way that we're understanding God. So what they emphasized was that the knowledge of God comes through the spiritual life, through the purification of the human from sin, and also his ability to come into communion with God, which takes place through repentance and through a life of virtue and purification of the soul. So when we are educating people, we can't just be thinking about academic qualities or how much information people are learning, but because to just learn about the teachings of the fathers, it's not the same thing as being transformed by those teachings. And so when you want, so it's one thing to be someone who knows about a subject and has a lot of knowledge of who different people are, what they wrote, and so on. But a person working in the church, they have to embody the divine life for their parishes or for the people around them, in a way that to make the heavenly kingdom present on earth. This can't be done just by learning certain facts, but the person has to be transformed themselves by divine grace in order to be able to convey that grace to other people and to convey experience of what the kingdom of God is like. So in teaching them about, teaching students about the teachings of the church, there also has to be an effort to try to bring the students into that experience so that they will be turning away from sins, be drawing closer to God, themselves experiencing divine grace, to be able to be transformed and to be able to bring this experience to others around them in the future ministries, whether they're priests or working with children. There's the problem we have sometimes, we hear about scandals where the different people working in the churches are, living, let's say, improper lives, and then creating damage to the souls of people around them. So, of course, this is a kind of extreme thing where, let's say, criminal activities are taking place and we're harming other people. So obviously, we're not communicating God's kingdom to anyone. We're doing evil, sort of under the name of something good. But more than this, in St. John Chrysostom talks about the problem of indifference, so that even a person who doesn't do any, let's say, obvious mistakes or bad things, if they are themselves indifferent to God, indifferent to the people around them, they're not experiencing divine grace themselves, and they're not able to convey the love of God to the other people. So the part of this of the theological education has to be the cultivation of spiritual effort that overcomes indifference in the person, that let's say an inner repentance throughout their life that will be able to keep them in close communion with God, and therefore make them able to be channels of the divine grace to other people. So this is different sometimes in the Catholic Church, because in the medieval Catholic Church we saw that philosophy became a sort of major part of the theological education. Actually, today you have to study philosophy before you go on to study theology. So it's seen as a kind of branch of philosophical knowledge. So you have to be a very educated person to be able to teach about the Christian faith. Or in the Protestant world, often there's the emphasis on the languages in order to be able to study scriptures. So people have to study Greek, they have to study Hebrew to become, let's say, scholars of ancient languages, scholars of how to, let's say, exegesis, how to interpret the passages of scripture. But although these things might be valuable to have some philosophical education, have some knowledge of sciences that could help us understand the scriptural passages, of course, are good things. But if we don't have this connection with God, then the students that are graduating from the schools, I think, are more likely to do harm than good. The other thing that we have is the continuity with the fathers. It's not based on our intellectual abilities to be able to teach Orthodox doctrine, or even kind of our historical knowledge, but rather that we are living within the tradition of the fathers, and that it's actually it's not just as a kind of external guide, let's say, but that because the fathers lived the lives of saints, this is what sort of guarantees the correctness of their doctrine, because being in communion with God, they also preserved the teachings of the church uncorrupted. And this lesson and example has to be communicated in theological education, that we can't have people trying to think that they can authoritatively talk about doctrine if they are not, in humility, kind of recognizing the sanctity of the fathers, and that this is really the source of their ability to know and to preserve our Orthodox teachings. So I think in Orthodox Church we have to recognize that our church and tradition has its own a kind of living idea of what the theological education is. That it's not something that's unconnected to the personal life, but it really has to come from the personal experience of God, and also in obedience to the church's tradition. Okay, so church history is something that in the English language has been taught for some time, not just by the Orthodox, but when we are teaching an Orthodox institution, we have to be not just following the, let's say, ideas of non-Orthodox who are teaching about church history, but we have to look at the church history from an Orthodox perspective. So let's say a Protestant view of church history often looks at, or a secular view, looks at the history of the church, that the fathers, as people who made errors. They were kind of not fully informed with modern knowledge, and in some ways a kind of alien Christianity from the modern Christianity. So in some of the concepts of modern theology that come out of Protestantism, of course, did not exist in the early church, or things in this, even in Catholic theology, things that emerged from the scholasticism of the Middle Ages. Again, if they didn't exist in the early church, these church history written from the point of view of the medieval scholasticism or the Protestantism would tend to look back at the patristic period as kind of primitive or inadequate, and in many ways critically. But from the Orthodox point of view, we see the fathers as the foundation of the true teachings of the church. And so we have to teach church history from their point of view, that these are the church, these are the church's voice, let's say, and that when we are explaining the history of the church and the fathers, we're explaining, in a sense, God's revelation of himself through the history of the church. And we have to take the positions of the fathers as our guide and not assume a kind of superiority as modern people, because the point of view of our modern world is actually an inadequate one, because it's one that's lost its connection with the divine life and with the tradition of the church. This is something I thought was very important with the work of Father John Meindorf, where he was going through, as he's teaching church history, he's looking at it from the point of view of the church and giving the importance to the Eastern fathers, who often ignored by the West. St. Cyril of Alexandria, for instance, often criticized in the West, but he's so central to the doctrine of Christ in the Orthodox Church. But the criticisms are because in Western theology, often the Orthodox fathers are not really understood very well. So we have to kind of, even though we have a lot of materials that have been written by Western scholars that can be very helpful, in the English-speaking world, we have to, let's say, use those materials critically and realize that they're not coming from the church's point of view, and that we have to use the church's understanding to present the church history in a way that reflects the church's viewpoint. This is true, especially when we get to the time of Augustine. In Western Christianity, Augustine is seen as the foundation of Western Christianity, I mean, in which he is in a way. But so the fathers that disagreed with Augustine sometimes were considered to be partly heretical or somehow inadequate. But in fact, from the Orthodox point of view, the Greek fathers or the Western fathers who disagreed with Augustine, those were the ones that were preserving the Orthodox faith, the tradition of the church. And Augustine's ideas, which were heavily influenced by philosophy and by his philosophical viewpoints, really were a variation. And it's interesting that Augustine is one of the very few, perhaps the main person in the first centuries of the church who questioned, kind of in a sense, did not consider it necessary to follow the teachings of the fathers, but thought that his personal understanding and reasoning should have a priority over the faith of the church. This is something that's foreign to the Orthodox Church. We consider that the church is that the truth of the church is preserved in the tradition passed down by the fathers, not based on our own logic and our own intellectual insights, but rather by the common consensus of the fathers. This later on, so as we may know, in the later period, the Western Church rejected a lot of the teachings of the spiritual writers of the Church. Especially this was during the controversy with Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, where he defended essentially the Orthodox tradition as a whole, the real experience of God in this life. And in the Western Church, this was condemned. But many Orthodox writers in later centuries simply followed the interpretation of church history of Western authors, and in a way, let's say the actual authentic tradition of the church was often obscured by these Western viewpoints. So part of our task now as Orthodox educators is to recover what really are the teachings of the Orthodox Church, and how to present these again to the Church in the modern world. And in fact, that this has been a project that actually has been very important, not only for the Orthodox, but as a way of making the spiritual teachings of the Church available to people in the Western world, so that they can now, just when they're looking at Orthodoxy, not just see it as a kind of pale imitation of the Western tradition, but to see the spiritual values preserved in the Orthodox faith.